This book is the most remarkable piece of literature this world has ever seen. The Bible has outsold every other publication, been translated into more languages than any other. Some people were so committed to the concept of this being God's book that they were even willing to die for that proposition. At the hands of Nero, they were fed to the lions, or they were burned at the stake by Bloody Mary, Queen of England. Others used this same book as a justification for crusades that killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. This is the story of how the Bible survived from the time of Moses until it reached the shores of America on the Mayflower.
God's first written communication with man was called the Decalogue. It means the 10 words. You and I know it better as the 10 Commandments. These were first given in an oral form, and then they were written down. Moses was asked to go up the mountain a second time, and God added to them the rights of people, the rights of property, and the rights of piety. This time, when Moses came down the mountain, Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. These became known as the Book of the Covenant. These, in fact, outside of a record of the Battle of Amalek, became the beginning of sacred writings, which today we call the Bible. It took 1,500 years to compile it. 40 different authors contributed, and they wrote in 3 different languages. Some of them used poetry, some history, and others biography. Many who wrote were kings or warriors, and others were priests or peasants. Some were devoted patriots and others were outlaws. What they produced has come to us in 2 testaments, comprised of 66 books. There is a word that needs to be a part of your vocabulary if it isn't. The word I'm referring to is the word canon. It refers to the collection of books which constitute the Bible. I'm interested in the Bible as that related to the Jews. They believed that the Bible was given by men with a special revelation that came from God, and that it was ultimately and finally the authority of all matters. It was the highest court of appeal to which man could go. The Bible that they have is not any different than the Bible that we have in terms of the Old Testament. They will tell you that the canonizing of the Scripture is not something that happened overnight. It's not decided at one council meeting. It's something that gradually takes place by God. When it did, they divided it into 3 parts. They had the law, or what they referred to as the Torah. They had the prophets, and then they had the writings, or what is referred to as the Hieroglyphia. It happens to be that if you look in Luke's Gospel, chapter 24, and in verse 44, you will notice that is exactly the same division of the Bible that was given by Jesus. Writing was primitive, and there were no small letters, or vowels, or punctuation marks, and no spaces between words. and they wrote from the right-hand side of the page to the left. They only had 22 books in their Bible. It was, nevertheless, the exact same material that's in the 39 books of our Old Testament. But how did the accumulation of such writings occur? It is stated in Exodus 24:4, "And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. These were placed by the side of the Ark of the Covenant. Joshua then added to them, and Samuel still later. These, along with other references, show that the records of the Bible gradually grew and were, in the process, safely protected." Not only were the books of Moses written 1,500 years before Christ, but remember, according to tradition, the book of Job was written 400 years before that. In 586 BC, when the Babylonians came in and decided to desolate the land, they burned everything that was burnable in the temple, and then they pulled down all of the rocks or bricks that constituted it. They took the people for 70 years captivity. When they came back from the 70 years captivity, scattered over all the world, they built little synagogues, places where they could worship and educate. And that required a Bible for each one of these synagogues, and that brought a new institution, that of the scribes. They were fastidious. They regulated themselves as follows. They could only use clean animal skins, both to write on and even to bind the manuscripts. They could have no less than 48 and no more than 60 lines on a page. The ink must be black, of a special recipe. They must verbalize aloud each word while they're writing it. They must wipe the pen and wash their entire bodies before writing the word Jehovah, and every time they write it. There must be a revision within 30 days, and if 3 pages required correction, the entire document must be replaced. The letter, words, and paragraphs must be counted, and the document becomes invalid if 2 letters even touch each other. All documents could only be stored in sacred places, and all old and worn documents were buried with ceremonial pomp. Before the invention of the printing press, this painstaking process helped contribute to the Scriptures' remarkable accuracy when compared to recent archaeological discoveries. When Alexander the Great conquered the world, it was an age of philosophical reasoning. Men were asking questions. There were stars in the field of questions like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, but they didn't have answers to their questions. They only had the questions. But they left the mind of man with a vacuum, with a vacancy, something that had to be filled in, and they were waiting for somebody who could come and give them the answer to the questions. By the time that Alexander died in 323 BC, the world had become bilingual, and Greek was the second language everyone used. For this reason, it became important to have a Greek translation of the Bible. At this time, around 285 BC, there were many Jews who were part of the Egyptian subculture. According to tradition, Demetrius of Phalerum, head of the world-famous library in Alexandria, asked King Ptolemy Philadelphus of Egypt if he could arrange to have a Greek translation of the Jewish law made for the library. To accomplish that, the king released 100,000 Jewish slaves that he had in his realm, and he sent them, along with a very generous gift and an ambassador, to Eleazar, the high priest of Jerusalem. And he made this request. He wanted him to collect 6 scholars from each of the 12 tribes, constituting 72 men. These 72 men were to go to Alexandria to do the translating work. When they went to Alexandria, they were given a royal welcome at the courts. They were then sent to the island of Pharos, And on that island, specially prepared, there were 72 cubicles, one for each of the men, and in 72 days they translated the entire Torah. They were so encouraged by what they did, each man agreed with the other man's translation. They called the work that they accomplished the Septuagint. That is the Greek word for 70. Ever since the Babylonian captivity, the Jews have been living under some form of oppression. The Old Testament is permeated with prophecies that foretell of a Savior who would liberate the Jews and crush their enemies. Both Jewish and Christian scholars will agree that a central theme of the Bible points to a Messiah, a Christ. The conclusion, therefore, is that the Old Testament is Christocentric. It comes to us like an old weather-beaten chart that's out of focus. The men, for example, that walk across its pages like Adam, like Abraham, like Moses, like David. The structures that they built, like a tabernacle, having 2 separate veils and 7 pieces of furniture. The wall of that last tabernacle being behind me at the moment. When the blurred became clear, it focused on the person of a Jewish Messiah. New Testament writers claimed that Jesus Christ was that Messiah. They were willing to admit that he did commit miracles, but because he was a carpenter's son, they weren't willing to admit that it was powered by God. They believed rather that it was energized by Satan. There's no question it's what the apostles believed. They said to him, gave all the prophets witness that through his name whosoever believeth in him. And the biggest problem of all that he had was that he claimed the title of a king, and that made the Roman Empire a little bit nervous. The theme of the New Testament puts a spotlight on this Christ, whom they believed to be Jesus of Nazareth. The Jewish religious leaders strongly denounced their conclusion. In their minds, they saw him as a fraud who could never be the Savior that was foretold by the prophets. To the writers of the New Testament, Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah. They contended that only in retrospect could you see all the scriptures that foretold of this man. And it was the message of this man that would later embody almost the entire text of the New Testament. I invited you here to this little sleepy town of Bethlehem that goes all the way back into the book of Genesis because it has 1,000 memories. Some of them are tragic and some of them are triumphant. On these hills behind me, it's the place where David tended his sheep, and it's the place where Samuel the prophet came and anointed him so that he became a king over Israel. But the most stupendous event of human history, according to Christians, happened in this little town. I know when I say the name Jesus Christ that you have heard about him. Maybe you forget. He is an actual person that lived in history. The people that lived contemporary with him identify him. And there's no question they speak about the enormous influence that he had and the purported miracles that he performed. He made some fantastic claims about himself. He claimed to be the Son of God. He said that he was sent by the Father to lead humanity into salvation. He also claimed that he was the way, the truth, and the light, and that no man could come unto God except it was through him. Confucius, Buddha, and even Muhammad never made such bold claims. But his greatest prediction related to his sacrificial death, to be followed by a resurrection from the dead 3 days later. To the Jewish religious leaders of his day, his claims were preposterous, in fact blasphemous. So they handed him over to Roman authorities, and the Roman authorities took him to a place called the Place of a Skull. which many historians to believe at this location. And there, against a gibbet of wood, they crucified him. But this rock isn't the end of his story. Near the place of the skull where they crucified him, there was a garden, and in that garden was a new rock-hewn tomb. And in that tomb, they laid his lifeless body. It is believed by many historians that this could be the location where that happened. They took a large stone and rolled it against the door. They sealed it, and then they posted a guard of Roman soldiers around it. It was early the next Sunday morning that the women came to embalm the body. When they got here, they found out that the body had already been embalmed. The embalmment was still in its place, but the body was missing. Now, the disciples said that it's because he was resurrected from the dead. But the authorities tried to give every other conceivable explanation to explain why the body was missing. They said, for example, that the disciples came and stole it. But they never explained how they could have stolen it, and they never issued a warrant to arrest them. The soldiers said, we fell asleep when we were on duty. But nobody ever reprimanded them for being asleep on duty. And what court in the land would accept as a creditable witness the people who were asleep when the crime was committed? To the authorities, his death was the closing of an unpleasant chapter in the calendar of an upstart religious sect. To writers of the New Testament, the resurrection of Jesus was an absolute confirmation that he was the true Messiah. The Apostle Paul wrote that if Christ be not raised from the dead, our faith is futile. Whether it was fact or fiction, it literally transformed the disciples from men who were afraid, hiding behind locked doors, to leaders who were willing to be persecuted and even die for their faith in this man. If we were to take the first century and divide it according to truth, it would fall into a threefold division. First, it was living truth. At that time, the master of the disciples was alive, and as long as he lived, his words were important. It is stated according to Dr. Luke, who wrote his gospel, that he was mighty in word and in deed, meaning that his words were oracles and his deeds were miracles. When you come into the second period, from 30 to 50, it's a period of oral tradition. They didn't bother writing anything because they believed that he was going to come quickly and writing was unnecessary. But when you go into the third division, from 50 to 90, that's the period of written communication. It was at that time that certain conditions came about that required the writing of letters. And it was those letters which became the basis of our New Testament. Christianity was growing at such an explosive rate that the apostles couldn't keep up with its rapid expansion. The writing of letters became an indispensable tool to communicate to the fledgling church. In some cases, they wrote to reprove, in other cases to encourage. These same letters would become part of the Bible. Peter wrote to the Hebrew Christians who were scattered throughout Asia Minor because of severe persecution and for which they needed the strongest encouragement. Though he faded from the picture by Acts chapter 12, he was faithful to the end of his days. John, being the youngest of the apostles, outlived them all. He wrote 3 letters or epistles which inspired holy living, and a gospel which highlighted some of the things that were omitted by the other 3 writers. His most outstanding work was written while he was in exile on the Isle of Patmos. He lifted the veil and allowed us to look into the future in his book that became known as the Revelation. But the most notable and prolific writer of the New Testament was the most zealous persecutor of the church in his early days, Saul of Tarsus. It had been 7 years since Jesus Christ had ascended, and a problem brewed between Hebrew and Grecian widows, and in order to solve it, they selected 7 men whom they called deacons. All of the 7 had Greek names. 2 of them came into the limelight. One was Philip, one was Stephen. Stephen was the first one to get the focus of attention. He had gone before the Sanhedrin, accused them of murdering the Messiah, and based on a verse in Isaiah, contended that God did not dwell in one single place. What he said enraged both Sadducees and Pharisees. The reason the Sadducees didn't like what Stephen said is because they didn't believe in angels or a life after death, and they only accepted the inspiration of the Pentateuch. The reason the Pharisees didn't like it, who believed in the inspiration of Isaiah, they didn't like his interpretation. So they took Stephen and they brought him to this location at what's known as Stephen's Gate, and they stoned him. He was the first martyr, and since his day, arenas' floors have been soaked red with human blood. When that enraged mob started to stone Stephen, they had to take off their coats to do the job. There was a middle-aged man, inactive in what they were doing, and they put their garments at his feet. He saw things, he heard things, and he felt things that he never forgot the rest of his life. They referred to him as Saul, but he later became known to us as Paul the Apostle. Paul's home was in Tarsus of Cilicia, a Greek province, and its environment of philosophers, grammarians, and poets must have contributed to his mental skills. His family were of the strictest Jews. Both he and his father were Pharisees. He was fluent in the Hebrew language. He selected the rabbinical college at Jerusalem for his training, and he sat at the feet of the highly esteemed Gamaliel. When he later stood before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, he informed them that he was a Roman, meaning that he held Roman citizenship. Their reactions to that information testified to its value. That citizenship exempted him from slavery, excused him from degrading punishments like scourging and crucifixion. It gave him the right to appeal any lower court decision to the emperor. And most important of all, it provided him with the freedom to roam the world. He became possessed of an uncontrolled passion to persecute Christians, as he had watched them do with Stephen. His thirst was insatiable. He enlarged the realm of his persecution, taking him on a mission to Damascus. And on that journey, through a vision, he was dramatically converted to Christ. His passion, however, never subsided, merely redirected. When the city of Damascus heard about his conversion and his presence in the city, they determined they were going to take his life. They posted a guard at every single gate. But from the wall, through a window, in a basket, his friends let him down and he escaped. He went to Arabia for 3 years. He went to visit the apostles in the city of Jerusalem. Then the church at Antioch called him for service, and then later they ordained him to the Christian ministry. He became a legend in his own day. He started pioneering Gentile churches on 2 separate continents, in 3, if not 4, separate missionary journeys. His work was tireless for 30 years. He traveled over 12,000 miles on land and sea in a day without the convenience of modern transportation. Most of the miles were covered on foot. When he stopped, he became the center of riots, and at one of these they stoned him and left him believing he was dead. Because of the tremendous scope of Paul's pioneering ministry, it necessitated the follow-up of letters to many of the churches he founded.
In this area, Paul became the most prolific writer of all the New Testament authors. He was the writer of over half the New Testament epistles, and many of these letters were written while he was in chains. His final letter was written during his imprisonment, waiting the decision of Caesar. I've taken a little intermission to bring you here to the city of Rome, particularly to the Mamertine prison where Paul was kept. It's about 20 feet below the ground, and about 50 yards away is the Roman Senate. Beyond that, the Roman Forum, and beyond that, the Palace of the Caesars, and then the dreaded Colosseum. The chariots went about across the roof where he was, on cobblestones, and all the business of an imperial Roman power was transacted right above him. Let's go down to the place where he was kept a prisoner. This is the actual cell from which Paul wrote that last letter that he ever wrote. He was in this location when he did it. When he wrote to the Romans, he earlier said that he hoped to have a prosperous journey by the will of God to come unto them. But when he came, he described himself as Paul the Aged. He had chains on his arms and soldiers around his body. He was cold. He talked about a cloak they had left at Troas. He was friendless. He said, Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present evil world. He said, at my first answer, no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. And he had the sense that it was all over. He said, I am now ready to be offered. If there was some way that it was possible for us to take the pulse of Paul so that we could tell what his heartbeat was and ask him a question, like, how are you doing, Paul? He would say, I am an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, of Jesus Christ, unafraid of the imperial power above him, by the will of God, not changed by the circumstance that appears to be adverse. We said, what about dying, Paul? How do you feel about that? He would have said, the time of my departure is at hand. I fought a good fight. I finished the course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness. In other words, when you measure the power of the pen, there's no way that you can question the fact it's sharper than any sword. The Apostle Paul was but one of a long list of writers of the New Testament who were martyred. According to tradition, Peter was supposedly imprisoned with Paul, and Peter died at the hand of the Emperor Nero. He was brought out, whipped, and crucified with his head down. According to John Fox, the historian, Peter chose to be crucified upside down because he didn't think he was worthy to suffer in the same way as Jesus. St. Thomas, according to tradition, traveled to India, where he was boiled to death for his faith. The only apostle to escape martyrdom was John. It is believed that he even survived being boiled in oil. However, he lived to be a very old man. All the other New Testament writers were crucified, killed by the sword, beaten with clubs, beheaded, or burned to death. The earliest fragment of the New Testament dates back between 120 and 150 AD. It is known as the Rylands manuscript and is kept at the University of Manchester in England. Believing that John's Gospel was written as one of the last books of our New Testament, the original document was written at the earliest but 25 years previously. There are no first edition copies of the Bible available. That should not alarm us after we learn about the fastidious concern over old documents and the meticulous supervision in preserving them. The Bible was given to us in fragments, and paleographers have had to piece together several separate documents in order to get one complete copy. The latest discoveries of these manuscripts have testified to the meticulous process of copying the scriptures, and if anything, dispelled the perception that the Bible is not an accurate translation from the original authors.
The most recent of these discoveries was made in 1947 in the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most important segment of that referred to as the Qumran. There were 11 caves here where they collectively found these documents, and in doing so it's believed that they were at least part of the library of a sect of the Essenes that had a little community built not far from where we are at the moment.